The sun was setting over Los Angeles when Richard Morgan parked his Mercedes in the garage of his mansion in Beverly Hills. At 45, the self-made businessman had built an empire from scratch, turning a small technology startup into one of the largest corporations in the country. On the outside, his life appeared perfect, but inside that three-story house, the silence was deafening. Helen, his wife, sat on the second-floor balcony as she did every afternoon. At 40, she still carried the elegance that once defined her, yet her once vibrant blue eyes now seemed distant, lost in a horizon only she could see. Richard ascended the stairs slowly, watching her. His heart sank when he noticed the deep, dark circles under her eyes. Another sleepless night, another day of shattered hopes. "How was your appointment today?" he asked softly as he sat beside her. Helen continued to gaze toward the horizon. "Just like all the others," she replied in a nearly whispered tone. "Dr. Fields said we can try again in a few months." "But—" Her voice faltered, and she couldn't finish the sentence. Richard took her hand, feeling its chill despite the warmth of the late afternoon. 7 years of attempts, 7 years of soaring hopes, only to have them dashed. Each new treatment brought renewed hope, and each failure dug an even deeper hole in Helen's soul. "Maybe we should take a break," he suggested cautiously. "Go on that trip you always wanted, see the vineyards of Tuscany." "For what?" Helen interrupted, turning to him for the first time. Her eyes shimmered with held-back tears. "So we can see all those happy couples with their children, so we can hear more people asking when we're going to have a baby." Richard felt utterly helpless. All his money, power, and influence could not give Helen the one thing she longed for more than anything. He had connections at every major hospital in the world. They'd already consulted the best fertility specialists and tried every possible treatment. Nothing worked. Dinner was served at 7, as always. The large mahogany table, far too big for just 2 people, only magnified the silence between them. Helen stirred her food absent-mindedly, while Richard tried to maintain a conversation about trivial matters, the traffic, the weather, news about the company. "We hired a new chief financial officer today," he commented, trying to distract her. "You should have seen how she impressed the board. I think we finally found someone who measures up." Helen nodded, though Richard knew she wasn't really listening. Her thoughts were far away, perhaps wandering through the many empty rooms of that enormous house, along hallways that had never echoed with children's laughter. After dinner, Helen went upstairs to bed, leaving Richard alone with his thoughts in his home office. He poured himself a glass of whiskey and sank into his favorite armchair, watching the city lights twinkle through the panoramic window. As CEO of Tech USA, he was used to solving complex problems and finding solutions where others saw only obstacles. But this time, for the first time in his life, he felt utterly at a loss. The phone rang, shattering his reverie. It was Charles, his personal assistant. "Mr. Morgan, sorry to disturb you at this hour, but we've got a problem with the contract for the West Coast branch. It seems there's a clause that—" "Can it wait until tomorrow, Charles?" Richard interrupted, rubbing his tired eyes. "Now is not a good time." After hanging up, Richard sat quietly, watching the amber liquid swirl in his glass. In his mind, he replayed every moment of the past few years. The hopeful smiles on Helen's face at the start of each new treatment, the silent tears when yet another attempt failed, the gradual dimming of the light in her eyes, like a candle flickering in the wind. Then came the sound of rain beginning to fall, pulling Richard back to the present. It was getting late, and tomorrow would be another day full of meetings and crucial decisions. He rose, set his glass aside, and began his nightly routine of checking that all the doors were locked. At the front door, something caught his attention, a faint, unusual sound, barely audible over the patter of the rain. Richard squinted into the darkness. There was something odd near the dumpster area, something that shouldn't be there. He hesitated for a moment before opening the door. The rain had intensified, and the neighborhood security would surely question his sanity if they saw him leaving at this hour. Yet something about that sound tugged at him, as if an invisible force was pulling him outside. Clad in his blazer, as best he could against the rain, He made his way across the garden toward the dumpsters. The sound grew clearer, a faint cry, almost inaudible. His heart pounded as he pushed aside a few bags of trash and discovered a small bundle huddled against the downpour. It was a baby, no more than a few months old. The infant was wrapped in a pink blanket, already soaking wet, and her tiny face was flushed from crying. For a moment, the world seemed to spin for Richard, unable to process the reality before his eyes. Without a second thought, he scooped the child into his arms and dashed back into the mansion. The baby was cold, and her cry had turned into a weak whimper that deepened his concern. He hurried up the stairs, calling out for Helen. "Helen! Helen! Wake up!" She appeared at the doorway of their bedroom, her eyes wide with worry. "Richard." "What? My God!" Her voice trailed off as she took in the sight of the little bundle in her husband's arms. "I found her at the back of the house," Richard panted. "She's freezing. We need to warm her up." Helen didn't hesitate for a second. Years of repressed maternal longing exploded into immediate action. She raced to the bathroom and began filling the bathtub with warm water as Richard carefully unwrapped the baby. "She needs dry clothes," Helen said, her voice trembling with emotion. "I'll grab something suitable." Richard watched in awe as his wife hurried into one of the empty guest rooms. In less than a minute, she returned with a set of baby clothes, still with their tags on, from a nursery outfit she had purchased years ago during one of their many fertility treatments. Together they bathed the little one, and gradually the baby began to calm, soothed by the warmth of the water and Helen's gentle touch. Richard noticed something different in his wife's expression, a light he hadn't seen in years, a sparkle that made her blue eyes glisten like sapphires. "She must be hungry," Helen said softly as she gently dried the baby. "We need some special newborn formula. There's a 24-hour pharmacy nearby." "I'll go," Richard offered immediately. "You stay with her." When he returned, 20 minutes later, he found Helen sitting in the bedroom armchair, rocking the baby and softly singing an old lullaby. The scene made his heart race. It was as if in that moment all the dreams they'd built together had materialized. "She's beautiful, isn't she?" Helen whispered, never taking her eyes off the child. "Look how perfect she is." Richard moved closer, watching the baby who now slept peacefully in his wife's arms. She had delicate, fair skin, tiny golden curls, and long lashes casting gentle shadows on her rosy cheeks. "We need to call the police," he said reluctantly. "Someone must be looking for her." Helen held the baby close as if Richard's words were a physical threat. "Not tonight," she pleaded, her voice breaking. "Please, Richard, just let her stay tonight. Tomorrow we'll do whatever is necessary, but for tonight, let her be." Richard knew it wasn't the right thing to do. As a businessman, he was used to following rules and always doing what was proper and legal. But when he saw the renewed spark in Helen's eyes, as if she'd come back to life in those few moments, he couldn't bring himself to insist. "All right," he conceded, sitting back beside her. "Just for tonight." Helen smiled, a genuine smile, the first in a very long time, and looked back at the baby. "You know what's amazing? She has the same blue eyes as mine." Richard gazed at the sleeping face and realized Helen was right. It was as if fate had handpicked this child for them, yet alongside that realization came a disturbing thought. Coincidences like this rarely happened by chance. The rest of the night passed in a dreamlike haze. Helen refused to put the baby in a crib, preferring instead to hold her close. Richard stayed awake, watching them both as his mind whirled with worries and possibilities. Who would leave such a tiny child abandoned, and why choose their home? More importantly, what would they do when the morning light brought reality crashing in? Morning arrived with deceptive calm. Helen had finally fallen asleep in the armchair with the baby in her arms, and Richard sat watching the two of them as the sun crept over the horizon. In his mind, dozens of scenarios unfolded, each more worrisome than the last. "Good morning," Helen murmured as she slowly opened her eyes. Her face looked different now. There was color in her cheeks and life in her gaze. She slept through the night. Richard stepped forward, gently tucking a stray lock of hair behind her ear. "Helen, We need to talk about what we're going to do." Before she could answer, the doorbell rang. It was far too early for visitors, and a shiver ran down Richard's spine. Downstairs, Martha, the housekeeper, had answered the door. "Mr. Morgan," Martha called. "Someone is here to see you. They say it's urgent." Richard and Helen exchanged apprehensive glances. "Stay here," he instructed, retreating toward the bedroom. "Try not to make any noise." Descending the stairs, Richard found a middle-aged woman dressed in professional attire, with a badge from the Department of Social Services hanging around her neck. His heart began to pound. "Mr. Morgan, I'm Beatrice Fields from the Social Services Department. We're investigating a sensitive case, and I believe you can help us." Richard maintained his composure. Years of tough negotiations had prepared him for moments like this. "Of course, please come in. Martha, bring our guest a cup of coffee." In the living room, Beatrice got straight to the point. "Mr. Morgan, we received an anonymous tip that there might be a child in this residence. Do you know anything about that?" An anonymous tip. Richard frowned, buying himself time. And why would someone make such a report? Beatrice studied him for a moment before continuing. "The child in question is of particular interest to a very influential family. I can't reveal too many details, but it's crucial that she be found as soon as possible." Upstairs, completely unaware of the conversation unfolding below, Helen was gently rocking the baby who had now woken. Her blue eyes, so much like the child's, shone with a maternal love that had long been suppressed. "Mr. Morgan," Beatrice continued in a more serious tone, "I need to be clear. If you know anything about this child and do not inform us, there could be serious consequences." Richard felt the weight of that veiled threat. As a CEO, he was used to handling pressure, but there was something in Beatrice's tone that disturbed him deeply. "Ms. Fields," he replied evenly, "I appreciate your concern, but I can assure you there is no child here. My wife and I have no children, as is publicly known." Beatrice slowly rose to her feet, her eyes scanning the room as if searching for invisible clues. "Very well, Mr. Morgan, but I must warn you, this situation is far more complicated than it seems. The family in question will not give up easily." After her departure, Richard remained in the living room, his hands trembling slightly as he cradled the untouched cup of coffee. Beatrice's visit confirmed his suspicions. The baby had not been left on their doorstep by chance. Returning upstairs to the bedroom, he found Helen playing with the little one, who now smiled and waved her tiny arms. The scene was so perfect that for a moment he hesitated to shatter it with his concerns. "Who was that?" Helen asked, noticing his tense expression. Richard sat on the edge of the bed, running a hand over his weary face. "Helen, we must be very careful. Someone knows about the baby, and from what I gather, powerful people are searching for her." "No," Helen said firmly as she held the child protectively close. "I won't let anyone take her away. She chose us, Richard. It isn't a coincidence that she appeared at our door." "But what if there's something bigger behind this? What if we're getting mixed up in something dangerous?" Helen looked at the baby, who was now playing with a lock of her hair. "Then we fight," she declared. "You always said you could get anything you want, that nothing was impossible. Prove it now, Richard. Help me protect her." In that moment, watching his wife and the child that fate had placed in their lives, Richard made a decision that would change everything. He picked up the phone and dialed a number he rarely used. "Attorney Sullivan, I need your help with a delicate matter. Yes, it's urgent. And we need complete discretion." Attorney Sullivan's office was located in a modest building in downtown Los Angeles. A seasoned family law attorney, he had handled numerous complex cases throughout his career. But something in Richard's voice set off alarm bells. "So," the attorney said after hearing the entire story, "you want to start an adoption process for a child who mysteriously appeared on your doorstep, even though you know that powerful people are looking for her?" Richard nodded firmly, holding Helen's hand. She had insisted on accompanying him to the meeting, leaving the baby in the care of Martha. "Attorney Sullivan," Helen leaned forward, "I know it sounds crazy, but there's something special about this girl. I can't explain it. It's as if she were meant to be with us." Sullivan sighed, adjusting his glasses. The issue isn't so much starting the adoption process. With your influence, Mr. Morgan, we could expedite the procedures. The real question is, who is this child? Where did she come from? And why is such a powerful family after her? At that moment, Sullivan's secretary burst into the room. "Sir, there's an urgent call on the line from Judge Margaret." Sullivan frowned. "Margaret, she never calls me directly." He answered the phone and listened intently for a few moments. His face grew steadily paler. "Richard," he said after hanging up, "you need to leave immediately." "What happened?" "Judge Margaret just informed me that she received a very unusual court order. A family is claiming custody of a child, alleging kidnapping. The address for the search and seizure is your mansion." Helen gasped. Richard sprang to his feet. "How much time do we have?" "The order will be executed in 2 hours. Go home, grab the baby, and get out. I have a country house in Blue Ridge, a place no one knows. I'll send you the address." Before the couple could even express their gratitude, they rushed out to the car. On the drive, Richard struggled to stay calm while Helen wept silently. "How did they find out so fast?" she whispered. Richard's suspicions only grew. Years in the corporate world had taught him that coincidences rarely occurred by chance. The morning visit by the social worker, the court order in the afternoon. Someone was always one step ahead. Back at the mansion, Martha was waiting at the door, visibly agitated. "Mr. Morgan, thank goodness. A woman was here earlier claiming she worked for the Anderson family. She said—" "Anderson family," Richard interrupted, his blood running cold. The Andersons were one of the oldest and most powerful families in the country, notorious for their murky business dealings. "Yes," Martha continued. "She said she'd be back with others. I got scared and locked all the doors. The baby is in the bedroom sleeping." Helen dashed upstairs while Richard processed the information. The Andersons, everything now made sense. For years his company had competed with the Andersons' business, though they had always kept a safe distance, until now. In their bedroom, Helen was already packing a small bag with clothes and diapers. The baby stirred and smiled at the sight of the familiar face. "It's going to be all right, my love," Helen whispered, as she scooped the child into her arms. "I won't let anyone take you away from me." Richard entered the room carrying his laptop and a stack of documents. "We have to go. Martha will stay behind so nothing seems amiss. I left instructions for her to say we left for overseas last night." "Where are we going?" Helen asked, carefully holding the baby. "First to Attorney Sullivan's office, then—" He hesitated. "Then we need to uncover the true story behind this child. Why do the Andersons want her so badly? And why did they choose our home to leave her?" As they headed for the door, Richard's cell phone rang from an unknown number. After a moment's hesitation, he answered. "Mr. Morgan," a female voice different from the morning social workers spoke. "Don't hang up, I know about the baby, and I know why she's with you. I used to work for the Andersons. You need to protect her. The truth about her could bring down one of the most powerful families in the country." "Who are you?" Richard demanded, motioning for Helen to continue toward the car. "My name isn't important. What matters is that the child's mother is alive, and she discovered something that was never meant to be uncovered. That's why she had to hide her daughter." Before Richard could ask another question, the call abruptly ended. He glanced at the screen, only to see the number vanish. "Richard, come on," Helen called from the garage. He hurried outside, his mind racing with unanswered questions. Glancing in the rearview mirror, he saw his wife holding the baby close in the back seat. At that moment, he knew there was no turning back. It was no longer just about protecting an abandoned baby. It was about uncovering a truth that someone desperately wanted to keep hidden. Attorney Sullivan's country house turned out to be more modest than Richard had imagined. A cozy refuge tucked among trees at the end of a gravel road in Blue Ridge. After 2 tense hours on the road, with Helen constantly checking the rearview mirror, they finally arrived at their temporary sanctuary. "It isn't much," said Sullivan, who greeted them on the porch, "but no one will be looking for you here." Inside, the house exuded a warm charm with simple furniture and a peaceful atmosphere that sharply contrasted with the turmoil in their lives. Helen immediately sought out a comfortable spot for the baby, who had dozed off during the drive. "I have some news," Attorney Sullivan announced as he poured coffee for everyone in the modest living room. "I did some discreet digging on the Andersons. The family patriarch, Albert Anderson, has been acting very strangely these past few months. Secret meetings, suspicious financial maneuvers." "And what does that have to do with the baby?" Helen asked, sitting near the sofa where the little one slept. "I'm not sure yet, but—" The attorney was interrupted by the buzz of Richard's cell phone. "It's the same number as before," Richard noted, showing the screen to Sullivan. The attorney motioned for him to answer and put the call on speaker. "Mr. Morgan?" The same female voice resonated through the phone. "Did you manage to get out in time? Who are you? Why can't we meet in person?" A tired sigh preceded the response. "My name is Clara Sanders. I was the personal secretary to Albert Anderson for 15 years, until 3 months ago. I can't meet you face to face because I'm under surveillance, but you need to know the truth." Richard, Helen, and Attorney Sullivan exchanged tense glances. Clara continued, "The child's mother, Beatrice Anderson, is Albert's youngest daughter. She uncovered documents proving that her father was involved in a scheme far worse than simple corruption. When she confronted him, he threatened her." Helen covered her mouth with her hands, instinctively glancing at the sleeping baby. "Beatrice was pregnant at the time," Clara went on. "The child's father was Marcus Taylor." Richard nearly dropped the phone. Marcus Taylor was his fiercest rival in the market, a man who owned the second-largest tech conglomerate in the country and was a declared enemy of the Andersons. "Impossible," Richard murmured. "The Andersons and the Taylors have been at odds for decades." "Exactly," Clara replied. "It was a secret relationship. When Albert found out, he was furious, not only because of the family rivalry, but because Marcus had evidence that could have destroyed the Andersons. Beatrice knew her father would never accept the child." "Where is Beatrice now?" Helen asked, her voice trembling. "She's in hiding. She orchestrated everything. Faking her own disappearance, she left the baby in a place where she knew she would be safe, with people Albert couldn't simply intimidate or bribe. That's why she chose our home," Richard concluded. "She knew I had the power to take on the Andersons." "Indeed," Clara confirmed, "but there's more. Albert doesn't just want the baby. He plans to use her as leverage to force Beatrice to return and hand over the documents she concealed." Just then, the baby stirred on the sofa, making tiny sounds as if on the verge of waking. Helen immediately went to her, cradling the infant protectively. "What are we going to do now?" Helen asked as she gently rocked the baby. Richard exchanged a look with Attorney Sullivan, who was already tapping away at his laptop. "First," Sullivan said, "we need to make sure you're legally protected. I'll file for temporary custody, claiming abandonment." "And then?" Helen pressed. Richard stepped closer, placing a reassuring hand on his wife's shoulder as he watched the baby play with a curl of her hair. "Then we'll find Beatrice. She entrusted her daughter to us and we won't let her down." "But what about Marcus Taylor?" Sullivan interjected. "If he truly is the father—" "He's a crucial piece of this puzzle," Richard agreed, "and perhaps our only chance to confront the Andersons on equal terms." As night fell outside and the temperature dropped, Helen wrapped the baby in a warmer blanket, humming softly. The little one smiled, blissfully unaware of the storm gathering around her. Richard surveyed the scene, feeling the weight of the responsibility they'd taken on. It was no longer just about fulfilling Helen's lifelong dream of becoming a mother. It was about protecting an innocent child caught in a conspiracy far bigger than they could have imagined. And to do that, they would need every ally they could find, even the most unlikely ones. The following morning brought disturbing news. Richard, who had spent a sleepless night monitoring his contacts, received an email from his chief financial officer. All the accounts of Tech USA had been frozen due to suspected irregularities. "It's a direct attack," he told Helen as she fed the baby from a bottle. "The Andersons are using their connections in the financial system to pressure us." Attorney Sullivan, who too had been up all night, was furiously typing on his laptop. "They're faster than we thought. They've even secured a favorable temporary court order." Helen clutched the baby to her chest. "I'm not going to give her up, Richard, no matter what they do." "And we won't," he promised, though his voice betrayed his worry. "But we need to act quickly. Sullivan, how long before the police come looking for us? With the Andersons' influence?" with them on your tail a few hours at most? Running a hand through his graying hair, Richard thought back on a lifetime built on calculated decisions and measured risks. Now for the first time he had to act with his heart rather than his head. "I need to find Marcus Taylor," he announced finally. "What?" Helen protested, alarm rising. "That's extremely dangerous. If the Andersons find out—" "It's our only chance," Richard interrupted. "If he really is the father, and if he has evidence against the Andersons like Clara said, we need him on our side." Sullivan closed his laptop. "I have a contact over at Taylor's office. I can try to arrange a discreet meeting." "No," Richard said, grabbing his cell phone. "I'll call him directly. After years of competing in the market, I'm owed at least that much." While Richard made the call, Helen cradled the baby, who now played with a small teddy bear. In just a few days, that little child had become the center of their entire world. "Taylor agreed to meet me," Richard announced after hanging up. "Alone in 1 hour at Griffith Park." "That sounds like a trap," Helen protested. "Maybe," Richard admitted, "but what choice do we have?" Attorney Sullivan volunteered to stay at the house with Helen and the baby, while Richard went to the meeting. Before leaving, Richard embraced his wife for a long moment. "Promise you'll come back," she whispered. "I always do," he replied, kissing her forehead. Griffith Park was surprisingly empty on that Saturday morning. Richard found Marcus Taylor sitting on a bench by the lake, feeding ducks. At 50, his rival still carried the same air of elegance and possessed a penetrating gaze that had made him famous in the corporate world. "Morgan," Marcus greeted him without rising. "I must admit, your call took me by surprise." Richard sat down beside him, keeping a safe distance. "I know about Beatrice Anderson and about the baby." Marcus's face paled slightly, yet his voice remained steady. "I don't know what you're talking about." "Your daughter is with my wife right now," Richard continued. "Beatrice left her on our doorstep because she knew she had to protect her from Albert Anderson." Marcus stopped tossing bread to the ducks, his eyes fixed on the water. "How do you know it's my daughter?" "Clara Sanders told us everything." "Clara," Marcus echoed bitterly. "She always knew too much for her own good." "The Andersons are after the child," Richard pressed. "They've frozen my accounts and even secured a court order. It's only a matter of time before they find us." "And what do you want from me?" "The truth, and your help in protecting your daughter." Marcus finally turned to face him. "You have no idea what you're up against, Morgan. The documents Beatrice discovered, they're not just about corruption. They expose something far worse. Then help us bring it all to light." "It's not that simple," Marcus said, rising and glancing around nervously. "Albert Anderson has connections everywhere. Law enforcement, the courts, the media." "That's exactly why we need to join forces," Richard insisted. "You have the evidence, I have the resources. Together we can protect your daughter and Beatrice." After a tense moment, Marcus hesitated and then reached into his pocket, producing a small USB drive. "Here's a copy of the documents. Beatrice sent me before she disappeared, but I can't get directly involved. If Albert finds out—" "You're already in too deep," Richard interjected. "This is about your daughter." A group of joggers passed by and Marcus lowered his voice. "There's a man named George Sanders, Clara's brother. He works in the IT department for the Andersons. Look him up. He might be able to help locate Beatrice." Before Richard could ask further questions, Marcus was already walking away. "Take care of her," he called over his shoulder. "And tell Beatrice. Tell her I'm sorry." Richard sat on the bench for several more minutes, the USB drive heavy in his pocket. He had gained an ally, but he also knew he had plunged even deeper into dangerous waters. Whatever was contained in those documents was grave enough to make one of the most powerful men in the country tremble. The USB drive burned in Richard's pocket during the tense drive back to the country house. When he finally arrived, he found Helen pacing the living room, the baby sleeping peacefully on the sofa. "Thank God," she cried, rushing to embrace him. "I thought something terrible had happened." Attorney Sullivan had already set up his laptop with special security programs. "We need to examine these documents carefully," he warned. "The Andersons likely have systems in place to monitor any leaks of information." Richard connected the USB drive, and the three gathered around the screen. What they found left them speechless. It wasn't just spreadsheets or corporate memos. These were detailed records of a vast network of influence spanning decades. "My God," Helen whispered, covering her mouth with her hands. "They controlled everything behind the scenes?" The files revealed how the Andersons had manipulated judicial decisions, steered public contracts, and crushed competitors through a complex web of blackmail and favors. But there was something even more disturbing. "Look at this," Attorney Sullivan said, pointing to a folder labeled Project Phoenix. "These are records of children, dozens of them." Richard felt his stomach churn as he read the documents. Project Phoenix was an elaborate scheme for illegal adoptions, where children were ripped from their families through fraudulent processes and given to influential people who owed the Andersons favors. "That's why they want the baby so badly," Helen concluded, looking at the little one who slept peacefully. "It isn't just because of the connection to Taylor. They fear that Beatrice will expose the entire operation." Richard's cell phone vibrated, a message from an unknown number. "Our Lady of Silence Church. Tomorrow, after the 10 a.m. Service, come alone. See. Clara is helping us find Beatrice," Richard explained. "But it might be a trap. Or it might be our only chance," Helen replied. "If Beatrice is truly hidden at the convent..." Attorney Sullivan interrupted, checking his own phone. "I just received word from the courthouse. The Andersons have obtained a statewide search warrant. The police have already begun their sweep." Helen rushed to pick up the baby, as if afraid someone might snatch her away at any moment. The little one stirred from the sudden movement, but didn't cry, only gazed up at Helen with those familiar, soulful blue eyes. "We need a plan," Richard said, running his hand through his graying hair. "We can't just show up at the convent tomorrow unprotected." "I have an idea," Attorney Sullivan said as he began typing furiously. "I'll file an anonymous tip about Project Phoenix and send it to a few trusted journalists. If the Andersons realize we're ready to expose everything, they might panic and do something reckless," Richard interjected. "No, we need to be even more strategic." Helen, still softly rocking the baby, suggested, "What if we turn their own network against them? These documents show that many important people are involved. Surely some of these allies wouldn't want their names dragged through the mud." Richard looked at his wife with admiration. Years spent in the corporate arena had made her as shrewd a strategist as he was. "You're right. Sullivan, how long will it take to identify the most vulnerable names in these files?" "A few hours," the attorney replied, already focused on the screen. "But we must tread carefully. One false move and..." A sudden noise from the gravel road outside interrupted them. The three froze. Peering out the window, they saw headlights slowly approaching. "The back," Sullivan whispered. "There's a side road leading to the highway. My backup car is hidden there, with fake documents in the glove compartment. Go." "And you?" Helen asked, already gathering the baby's things. "I'll store them," Sullivan replied. "I have enough experience to keep any officer busy for a few hours." Richard hesitated only a second before grabbing the keys from Sullivan's outstretched hand. The attorney quickly began erasing all files from his laptop. "Meet us at the convent tomorrow," Richard instructed. "And thank you." "Go now," Sullivan urged. "And don't use your cell phones. They're almost certainly being monitored." Helen clutched the baby tightly as she stepped into the cool night air, shielding the little one from the chill as they made their way along the darkened path. Richard led the group, using his phone's flashlight to guide the way. Behind them, voices approached from the mansion. The baby, as if sensing the gravity of the moment, fell utterly silent, her blue eyes shining like tiny stars in the darkness. "Where are we going?" Helen whispered once they reached the car. Richard started the engine quietly. "First, we need to shake off any tails. Then..." He looked at Helen, cradling the baby. "Then we'll find her mother and put an end to this once and for all." By dawn, the imposing steeple of Our Lady of Silence Church loomed against the morning sky, a centuries-old structure, guarding untold secrets. Richard and Helen arrived just before the 10 a.m. service, after a night of evasive driving along back roads to elude potential pursuers. "Are you sure we should go in?" Helen asked, adjusting the baby in her arms. The little one remained calm, clutching a rosary that a kindly nun had given her at the entrance. Richard observed the steady stream of parishioners filing in. "We have no choice. If Beatrice is here, this is our chance to resolve everything." They took seats in the back pew, trying to appear as just another young couple with their baby. The service began, and the Gregorian hymns of the nuns echoed through the ancient walls, lending the scene an almost surreal atmosphere. Then Helen noticed something. Among the nuns in the choir, one seemed different, young, visibly tense. And her eyes, they were identical to the baby's. "Richard," Helen whispered, clutching his arm, "it's her." The young nun had also spotted them. Her eyes widened as she caught sight of the baby, and for a moment, her song faltered. Still, she maintained her composure, though her hands trembled noticeably. After the service, as the congregation dispersed, the young nun signaled for them to follow her. She led them down a side corridor to a small, secluded garden tucked away from the rest of the convent. "Bianca," the nun murmured, stepping forward with tears in her eyes. The baby instantly stretched out her tiny arms toward the woman, as if recognizing a long-lost presence. "Is it really you?" Helen asked hesitantly, reluctant to let go of the child. The young woman nodded, dabbing her eyes. "I can't. Believe you brought her here, it's too dangerous." "We had no choice," Richard explained. "Her father is using every resource at his disposal to find her." "I know," Bianca Anderson said nervously, glancing around. "The sisters took me in, but I don't know how much longer I can stay hidden. My father's eyes are everywhere." "We've uncovered the documents for Project Phoenix," Richard said, watching Bianca's reaction intently. Her face went pale. "So, now you know. It's not just about me or about Sophia. It's about all those children, all those families torn apart. Why didn't you go public with everything?" Helen asked softly. "Because my father is only the tip of the iceberg," Bianca replied. "There are judges, politicians, businessmen, people who would do anything to keep their secrets buried. When I discovered the truth, I knew my only option was to disappear." A sudden sound of footsteps made everyone freeze. An elderly nun appeared in the garden. "Sister Mary," Bianca breathed a sigh of relief. "It's safe. She's been helping me." Sister Mary hurried over. "Bianca, men are coming, a lot of them. They have a search warrant." Helen pulled the baby close, while Richard tried to think quickly. "The tunnel," Sister Mary blurted suddenly. "The old passage that connects the convent to the chapel on the hill. Only the oldest sisters know of its existence." "And after that?" Bianca asked desperately. "I can't keep running forever." Richard pulled out his cell phone. Though there was still no word from Attorney Sullivan, a message from an unknown number had just arrived. "Documents have been sent to federal authorities. We're ready, MT." "Marcus," Bianca whispered when Richard showed her the message. "He's helping us," Richard explained. "And he's not alone. Your father may have power, Bianca, but he isn't the only one." The sound of men's voices began echoing down the convent corridors. Sister Mary ushered the group toward an old door hidden behind a statue. "The tunnel will take you up to the chapel on the hill," she explained quickly. "From there you can catch a back road. There's a car waiting. Clara arranged everything." "Come with us," Bianca pleaded. The nun smiled kindly. "My place is here. I'll do my best to delay them. Now go." Helen hesitated for a moment before handing Sophia over to Bianca. To everyone's surprise, the baby did not cry. It only exchanged glances between the two women with eyes so alike. "She looks just like you," Helen said, her voice thick with emotion. "You protected her when I couldn't," Bianca replied, embracing her daughter tightly. "I can never thank you enough." The sound of doors being forcefully opened echoed throughout the convent. There was no time to waste. Richard led the group into the dark tunnel, illuminating their path with his cell phone. Behind them, they could hear the resolute voice of Sister Mary confronting the men invading her sanctuary. "This isn't just about running away," Richard said as they advanced. "It's time to fight." The car that Clara had arranged waited exactly where Sister Mary had indicated, a discreet vehicle hidden among the trees along the side road behind the chapel. But as they approached, Richard motioned for everyone to halt. "There's something wrong," he whispered, eyeing the car. "Clara said she'd leave the keys under the tire, but the door is ajar." Just then, a figure emerged from behind. The vehicle, Albert Anderson himself, impeccably dressed in a tailored suit that stood in stark contrast to the dusty road. "Bianca," he said in a soft, almost paternal tone, "enough of this charade, daughter. It's time to come home." Instinctively, Bianca recoiled, clutching little Sophia protectively. Helen and Richard stepped in front of her. "How did you find us?" Richard demanded, stalling as he searched for an escape route. Albert smiled, a cold smile that never reached his eyes. "Did you really think Clara was on your side? She's been working for me for 15 years. Loyalty has its price." "You're wrong, Father." Bianca's voice trembled yet grew stronger. "Clara helped us because she still has a conscience, something you lost long ago." "Conscience?" Albert scoffed bitterly. "Conscience doesn't build empires, daughter. It doesn't protect our family." "Family?" Bianca stepped forward, her voice rising. "You've destroyed families. All those children ripped from their parents to line your pockets with favors and blackmail." For a moment, Albert's smug smile wavered. "Everything I did was to protect our legacy, to ensure our power." "What power, Albert?" Bianca demanded. At that moment, a new voice joined the fray. Marcus Taylor emerged from the chapel, flanked by Attorney Sullivan and, to everyone's surprise, Clara Sanders. "Betrayal is everywhere," Albert muttered, his head shaking, though his voice trembled. "Even you, Clara." "It's over, Mr. Anderson," Clara said firmly. "The documents have been sent to federal authorities. Every piece of evidence, all the names, all the children." "Impossible," Albert protested, his face paling. "Those files were secured." "Not by me," Clara replied. "Not after 15 years of hiding your secrets. Every child you tore from a family, every life you ruined, I kept records." Meanwhile, Helen noticed movement among the trees, several men in suits approaching, but they weren't Albert's henchmen. "Federal agents," one announced, flashing his badge. "Mr. Anderson, you are under arrest for investigation." "You can't touch me," Albert tried to insist, struggling to maintain his composure. "I have powerful friends. Friends who are being arrested as we speak," the officer countered. "Your entire operation is falling apart, Mr. Anderson. Your so-called friends are too busy saving themselves to worry about you." As the agents closed in and cuffed Albert, he glanced at his daughter one last time. For a fleeting moment, the mask of power and arrogance fell away, and he looked tired and defeated. "You truly are your mother's daughter," he murmured, softly. "She never accepted my choices." Bianca said nothing, simply drawing Sophia closer. The baby, as if sensing the gravity of the moment, remained silent, her bright blue eyes absorbing everything with a wisdom beyond her years. Helen stepped forward, tears streaming silently down her face. "She will miss you," she whispered. Bianca looked at Helen, then at Richard, who had risked everything to protect his daughter. "It doesn't have to end like this," she said. "Sophia, she needs a real family, a true family." "What do you mean?" Helen asked, her heart pounding. "I want you to be her godparents," Bianca said, "and I want her to spend time with you because you've proven that true love isn't about blood or power. It's about the choices we make, and you chose to protect her, even when you didn't know who she was." Richard placed a steady hand on Helen's shoulder as she wept openly. Marcus Taylor approached them timidly. "Bianca," he began hesitantly, "I know I have no right, but if you'll have me—" "Sophia needs a father too," Bianca replied, a small smile breaking through. "A father who chooses to do what's right, even when it's hard." As Albert was led away by the Chiu agents, the sun began to set behind the chapel. A gentle breeze stirred the trees, as if nature itself sighed in relief at the end of this chapter. Attorney Sullivan stepped forward. "There's still much work to be done. We must locate all the families torn apart by Project Phoenix and ensure justice is served." "And it will be," Clara said, resolute, "because now we're not alone in this fight." Little Sophia giggled, breaking the tension. Her pure, innocent laughter echoed in the late afternoon air, a symbol of hope and a new beginning. A year later, the garden of the Morgan mansion was adorned for a very special celebration. Colorful balloons danced in the gentle breeze, and children's laughter rang out. It was Sophia's first birthday, a party that brought together not just one family, but several. From the veranda, Helen watched the scene with a heart overflowing with joy. Dressed in a light blue dress, Sophia took her first determined steps, alternating between the arms of Bianca and Helen. The little girl had become a bridge between two families that were now one. "I still find myself smiling when I think how everything changed," Clara said as she approached with 2 champagne flutes. "Thanks to you," Helen replied, accepting the glass. "Without your courage," Clara shook her head. "I only did what needed to be done a long time ago. You all deserve the credit for protecting Sophia when she needed it most." In the center of the garden, Richard talked with Marcus Taylor. What began as an unlikely alliance had grown into a solid partnership. Together, they had founded a charity, dedicated to reuniting families torn apart by Project Phoenix. 3 more families were reunited this week, Richard explained. Attorney Sullivan believes we'll locate all the missing children by year's end. "Some wounds never fully heal," Marcus observed, as he looked at Bianca with Sophia in her arms. "But we can help make the future brighter." Tech USA and Taylor's company had merged, forming not only a technology giant, but a corporation committed to social responsibility. The Anderson scandal had forever changed the business landscape, ushering in a new era of transparency and ethics. Bianca, now in charge of social projects at the foundation, approached with Sophia in her arms. The little girl immediately reached out to Helen, who greeted her with a radiant smile. "Sometimes I wonder," Bianca said softly, "if I somehow knew she would need all of you in her life, not just me, but an entire family." "Family isn't just about blood," Helen replied, watching as Sophia played with a pendant. "It's about love, choices, and second chances." Sister Mary, invited as a special guest to the celebration, watched with a serene smile. The Our Lady of Silence Church had become a beacon of hope, a sanctuary for women in vulnerable situations. Attorney Sullivan joined the group, having just returned from his latest court hearing. "Albert was convicted," he announced quietly. "Along with a dozen others involved in the scheme, justice may be slow, but it eventually comes." A small commotion arose when Sophia decided it was time to show off her new steps. With determination, she wriggled free from Helen's arms and toddled over to Marcus, who scooped her up with tears in his eyes. "She has your strength," he said to Bianca, "and the heart in all of us. And it's our love that makes her who she is," Helen added. Raising his glass, Richard proposed a toast to Sophia, who taught us that family is far more than we ever imagined, and to a future now brighter because of her. Everyone cheered as the sun dipped below the horizon over Los Angeles. Meanwhile, Sophia, blissfully unaware of the symbolism of the moment, laughed and moved from lap to lap, loved and protected by everyone around her. At the head table, a framed photo caught everyone's eye. Baby Sophia in Helen's arms with Bianca beside her. The image perfectly captured the moment when 2 families became one, united by love for a little girl who had appeared on a rainy night. "You know what's even more incredible?" Helen whispered to Richard as they watched Sophia play with other children in the garden. "That emptiness I once felt, it's gone. Not because I finally have a child in my life, but because I learned that true love has no limits or conditions." Richard embraced his wife, reflecting on how one impulsive decision had changed so many lives. "Sometimes," he said, "the greatest gifts come wrapped in the most unexpected circumstances." The celebration continued late into the night, with Sophia eventually dozing off in Helen's arms, while Bianca mingled with the guests. In that shared glance between the 2 women, an unspoken understanding passed. They weren't just godmother and mother. They were partners in a journey that had transformed their lives and the lives of many others. And little Sophia, sleeping soundly amid the festivities, was living proof that family is so much more than blood. It's a daily choice of love, protection, and care that blossoms in the most unexpected places.